July 1994, 2:14 a.m., Manhattan, New York, Leverage. A black sedan idles outside a high-rise where the son of a political dynasty sleeps under the watch of a skeleton crew. The odds are suicidal. The city is a fortress of federal agents and local police, all hunting for the remnants of the Medellin era. But the men in the car aren't there for a shootout. They aren't there to take the target to a safe house or a basement in Queens. They are there to take a photograph, a single image that would end a federal prosecution and silence the most powerful legal system in the world. This was the night the godmother decided that if the law wouldn't let her walk, she would make the law crawl. To understand why a woman locked in a federal cell was calling shots in the heart of New York City, you have to understand who Griselda Blanco had become by the early 90s. This wasn't the cocaine-fueled chaos of 1970s Miami. The days of motorcycles and submachine guns on the streets of Kendall were over. Griselda was no longer the street-level tyrant. She was an aging lioness trapped in a cage of steel and concrete. She was facing a mountain of murder charges, the kind that don't just lead to life sentences but to the electric chair. To the outside world, she was a relic. The FBI and the DEA were taking a victory lap, convinced they had finally neutralized the Black Widow. They thought they had her cornered, but the system made a fatal mistake. They underestimated her paranoia, and more importantly, they underestimated her understanding of the American soul. Griselda knew that in the United States, justice isn't just a blindfolded lady with a scale. Justice is a business, and like every business, it has a price. She wasn't looking to pay a bribe. She had plenty of money, but money couldn't buy off a federal prosecutor looking for a career-defining conviction. No, she was looking for a hostage. Not just any hostage, but someone so significant that the Department of Justice would be forced to shred her indictment just to keep the peace. The war on drugs was about to collide head-on with the survival of the American elite. By 1994, Griselda Blanco's legacy was written in blood across the state of Florida. She had survived hits, betrayals, and the deaths of 3 husbands. But now, the walls were closing in. Her most trusted hitman, Jorge Rivi Ayala, had turned informant. Rivi was the man who knew where all the bodies were buried, literally. His testimony was the silver bullet the government needed to ensure Griselda never saw the sun again. But Griselda had a code. You don't fight the witness. You fight the system that protects the witness. She began to look at the board differently. If the government wanted to use the law as a weapon against her, she would use their own reputation as a shield. She looked at the men prosecuting her, the men in Washington, the men who lived in high-rises and sent their children to Ivy League schools. These were the untouchables. They were the ones who made the rules, the ones who decided who lived and who died in the name of the law. To Griselda, they weren't heroes. They were just another cartel, only their uniforms were made of wool instead of leather. The plan began with a gift, a small gold St. Jude medallion. In the world of the godmother, St. Jude is the patron saint of lost causes. It was a symbol of her desperation, but also a calling card. She had it delivered not to a drug den, but to the doorstep of a man who moved in the highest circles of American power. It was a reminder that the godmother was always watching, even when she was in chains. It was a message that said, I know where you live, I know what you love, and I can touch it whenever I want. The federal government thought they had a secure perimeter around their witnesses and their prosecutors. They had Agent Bob Palombo, a veteran DEA agent who had spent years hunting Griselda. Palombo was a professional, a man who understood the mechanics of the drug trade. He thought he was playing a game of chess against a grandmaster. What he didn't realize was that Griselda had stopped playing chess. She was playing a game of survival, where the board was the entire country. The first day of the operation didn't involve a single shot. It started with a visitor. A low-level associate, someone the feds barely kept an eye on, visited Griselda in prison. They passed a handwritten shopping list. To the guards, it looked like a request for snacks and toiletries. In reality, it was a tactical map of Manhattan. It detailed the movements of a specific individual, a young man who represented the future of a political dynasty. He was the golden boy, the kind of person the system is designed to protect at all costs. 24 hours later, a high-ranking federal prosecutor received an anonymous call. The voice on the other end didn't ask for money. It didn't make threats. It simply described in vivid detail the birthmark on the prosecutor's son's shoulder. It described the way the boy walked to his internship, the coffee shop he visited at 10:01 a.m., and the color of the shirt he was wearing that very moment. The message was clear: your son is within our reach. The FBI went into a frenzy. They realized their secure surveillance of Griselda's associates had been compromised by a counter-surveillance team they hadn't even detected. They were being outmaneuvered by a woman who was supposed to be neutralized. They moved the target to a safe house, a secure location known only to a handful of agents. They thought they had regained control, but the next morning, when the agents checked the secure bed, they found a gold St. Jude medallion tucked under the pillow. The panic in the Department of Justice was palpable. This wasn't a standard kidnapping plot. Usually, when a cartel takes a hostage, they want money or a prisoner exchange. But Griselda was asking for something much more dangerous. She was asking for the government to admit its own vulnerability. She was demanding that they choose between their legal victory and the life of one of their own. Agent Palombo knew this was the end of his career-defining arrest if he couldn't stop it. He realized that the godmother wasn't just trying to escape. She was trying to humiliate the United States government. She wanted to prove that their laws were a fiction, that their war on drugs was a farce, and that no one, no matter how powerful, was safe from her reach. The logistics of the plot were being coordinated from a prison cell by Rivi Ayala himself. This was the ultimate irony. The man who was supposed to be the government's star witness was still working for the godmother. He was caught between a plea deal that would save his life and a boss who could end it with a single word. Rivi was the bridge between the two worlds, the man who knew how to navigate the bureaucracy of the prison system and the brutality of the streets. But Rivi had a weakness, a human vice that would eventually provide the feds with the one opening they needed. He was obsessed with phone sex lines. While he was supposed to be coordinating the most high-stakes kidnapping in American history, he was spending hours on the phone with anonymous women, running up bills, and, more importantly, leaving a trail of recorded conversations. Federal monitors, who had been listening to Rivi's calls for months, started picking up coded fragments. They heard mentions of the package, the photo, and the saint. At first, they thought they were stopping a murder. They thought the hit squads were moving in to eliminate the witnesses against Griselda. They had no idea that the kidnappers were already inside the building, waiting for a signal that had already been intercepted. The tension was building to a breaking point. The FBI was racing against a clock they couldn't see, hunting for a team of professionals who moved like ghosts through the city. Griselda sat in her cell, waiting. She didn't need to see the news. She didn't need to hear the sirens. She knew the fear she had planted was growing. She knew that in the sterile briefing rooms of Washington, D.C., powerful men were sweating, realizing that the Black Widow had just checked their king. She had spent her life building an empire on the bodies of her enemies, but this was her masterpiece. This was the night she would prove that even behind bars, her reach had no ceiling. The night she would trade the shadow of a prince for her own freedom. The air in the federal safe house was thick with the scent of stale coffee and the hum of high-end surveillance equipment. Outside, the world believed the son of the American elite was safe, tucked away in a secure location that didn't exist on any map. But inside that room the silence was deafening. Agent Bob Palombo looked at the gold St. Jude medallion sitting on the table, shimmering under the fluorescent lights. It wasn't just a piece of jewelry, it was a psychological anchor. It was the godmother's way of saying that walls, guards, and federal budgets were nothing more than tissue paper when she decided to reach out and touch someone. The problem wasn't that the FBI didn't have the resources. They had the best tech, the best shooters, and the best analysts. The problem was that they were playing a game of numbers, while Griselda Blanco was playing a game of nerves. She had spent decades mastering the art of the impossible hit. She knew that to break a man, you don't necessarily have to kill him. You just have to make him realize that you could have killed him at any moment, and that his life only continues because you allowed it. As the sun began to rise over the Manhattan skyline, the investigation hit a wall. Every associate they picked up, every low-level runner they squeezed, yielded the same result. Nothing. The ghost, the courier responsible for moving the medallion, had vanished into the city's concrete veins. But the federal monitors had one last card to play. They turned their focus back to Jorge Rivi Ayala. They knew Rivi was the architect, the man translating Griselda's violent poetry into street-level action. What they found was a man distracted. Rivi Ayala, the most cold-blooded enforcer in the history of the Medellin cartel, had a fatal flaw. He wasn't spending his time in his cell reviewing tactical maps or checking weapon manifests. He was on the phone, pouring thousands of dollars into a phone sex line. It was a bizarre, almost pathetic detail that seemed out of place in a high-stakes federal kidnapping plot. But for the FBI, it was the crack in the armor. They realized that Rivi's attention was divided. He was getting sloppy. The fragments of coded messages they intercepted between his private calls revealed a terrifying reality. The operation wasn't about a physical abduction anymore. The realization hit Agent Palombo like a physical blow. The kidnappers weren't trying to drag the boy out of the safe house. They knew the FBI would have 100 agents waiting for them. No, they were waiting for the click of a camera shutter. The scene shifted to a sterile federal briefing room in Washington, D.C. The air conditioning hummed, cooling a room full of panicked directors, high-ranking prosecutors, and men whose names appeared on the most powerful ballots in the country. They were prepared for a ransom demand. They had prepared for a hostage negotiation that would involve millions of dollars and a private jet to Colombia. They were ready for a war of attrition. Instead, a plain manila envelope was delivered to the front desk. There was no bomb inside. There was no ransom note written in cut-out magazine letters. There was only a single, grainy photograph. The room fell into a terrifying silence as the photo was passed around. It showed the target, the young man, the prince of the dynasty, sitting at a desk inside the secure safe house. The image was taken from a long-range lens, perfectly framed, but it wasn't just a picture of the boy. Superimposed over his chest was a small red laser dot. The date and timestamp at the bottom of the photo were from that morning, less than 2 hours prior. There was no gore. There was no violence. But the message was louder than any explosion. Griselda's team had bypassed every layer of federal security. They had found the unfindable location. They had been close enough to put a bullet through his heart a dozen times, and they had chosen to take a picture instead. The power shift was absolute. In that one grainy image, Griselda Blanco had stripped the United States government of its most valuable asset, its illusion of control. The godmother didn't want the boy's life. She wanted the fear that came with the knowledge that she owned it. She had turned the war on drugs into a personal negotiation. The room of powerful men realized that if they moved forward with the execution of Griselda Blanco, they weren't just killing a criminal. They were signing the death warrant of their own children. The Black Widow had just bought her way out of the electric chair without firing a single shot. In the next 72 hours, the machinery of justice began to grind in a different direction. It was subtle at first, a re-evaluation of the evidence in Florida, a sudden concern over the reliability of the star witness, Rivi Ayala. The prosecutors, who only days before were calling for the ultimate penalty, were now speaking in hushed tones about procedural errors and judicial economy. The federal government couldn't admit they had been blackmailed by a woman in a jumpsuit. They couldn't tell the public that the most feared drug lord in history had compromised the safety of the American ruling class. So they did what the system does best. They buried it. They allowed the case against Griselda to slowly dissolve. Rivi Ayala's phone sex scandal was used as the public excuse. His credibility was compromised by his personal habits, making him an unreliable witness for a capital murder trial. It was a convenient lie that protected the reputations of everyone involved. 6 months later, the most high-profile prosecution in DEA history fell apart. The mountain of murder charges that was supposed to bury Griselda Blanco under the prison floor was reduced to a handful of drug trafficking counts. The godmother, the woman responsible for hundreds of deaths, was handed a sentence that felt like a slap on the wrist. She had played the ultimate hand and won. The aftermath was a domino effect of quiet retreats. The Golden Boy was moved to an undisclosed location in Europe, far from the reach of the Medellin ghosts. Agent Palombo, a man who had dedicated his life to catching the godmother, watched as the woman he had hunted walked away from the abyss. He knew the truth, even if the official records would never show it. He knew that the system hadn't failed. It had been forced to submit. Griselda Blanco eventually finished her shortened sentence and was deported back to Colombia in 2004. She returned to a world that had moved on, a world where the Medellin cartel was a ghost of the past. She lived a quiet, almost invisible life in Medellin, far from the submachine guns and the towers of white powder. She was a ghost of the woman she once was, but she was a living legend, the woman who beat the feds at their own game. But the universe has a way of balancing the scales, even when the law fails. In 2012, as Griselda walked out of a butcher shop in Medellin, a motorcycle pulled up. 2 shots were fired. It was the motorcycle hit, the very tactic she had pioneered decades earlier on the streets of Miami. The Black Widow died on the pavement, a violent end to a violent life. But she died a free woman, having proven her final point. You can lock up the woman, but you can't lock up the terror she inspires. The night in Manhattan remains a dark footnote in federal history. While the identity of the target remains officially classified, The St. Jude medallions found in secure locations serve as a reminder of the night the rules were rewritten. In the world of high-stakes power, the most dangerous weapon isn't a gun. It's the knowledge of exactly what your enemy is willing to lose. Griselda Blanco understood that better than anyone. She didn't fight the law. She found the person the law was designed to protect and held them over the edge until the law blinked. The story of the godmother's final checkmate leaves us with a chilling question. If you were the prosecutor, standing in that room and looking at the photo of your child through a sniper's lens, would you have pushed for justice? Or would you have burned the evidence to save the one thing the system couldn't replace? It's a choice between the integrity of the law and the survival of the bloodline. In 1994, the American government chose the bloodline. Griselda Blanco proved that in the end, everything has a price, even justice. She may have died on a sidewalk in Medellin, but she died knowing that for one terrifying night, she had the most powerful nation on earth on its knees. If you want to dive deeper into the strategies and the hidden history of the world's most dangerous figures, there is another story waiting for you right here on the channel. Make sure to like this video, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss a deep dive into the shadows of history. Now, I want to hear from you in the comments. If you were in charge of that investigation, would you have risked the life of an innocent to ensure a monster never walked free? Or is there a line that even the law shouldn't cross? Let's talk about it below.